I was standing at the counter with a pen still in my hand when my son told me I was done. The fluorescent light over the back office was humming the way it always hummed, a little too loud, a little too white. I had a stack of checks in front of me, 17 of them, the second Friday of the month, and I had just signed the third one when Daniel came in holding his coffee like it was a prop in a meeting he'd rehearsed in his truck. "Mom," he said, "you're retired. You don't need a salary." Rachel was behind him in the doorway, arms crossed, not saying anything, which was somehow worse than if she had. I looked down at the check in front of me. Marcus Whitfield, forklift operator, 11 years with the company. $1,412 and change. My handwriting on the signature line was the same handwriting it had been for 31 years. I didn't argue. I didn't ask him to explain himself. I picked up the pen and I signed the fourth check. I didn't cry. I just stood there. My name is Eleanor. I'm 67 years old, and until that Friday in March, I had signed payroll for Whitfield & Sons Supply, a name we never changed because it was easier than admitting the Sons part had shrunk down to one, for 3 decades. I wasn't always the one holding the pen. I started as a bank teller at Farmers Trust in 1979, back when a teller still had to balance her drawer to the penny or stay until she did. I did that for 12 years, learned every way a number could hide a lie, and then I married a man named Frank Whitfield, who had a truck, a welding certificate, and a plan to open a small supply yard for contractors who didn't want to drive 40 minutes into the city for lumber and hardware. I did the books from the kitchen table for the first 6 years. I did the books from a real office after that, in the back corner of a building Frank bought with a loan I co-signed, because the bank wouldn't give it to him without me on the paper. Nobody ever mentioned that part at Thanksgiving. Nobody mentioned the years I worked the front counter on Saturdays while Frank was out on deliveries, either, or the winter I took a second part-time job at the pharmacy in town, so we could make payroll ourselves the month a contractor stiffed us on $11,000 of lumber. Those years don't show up in anyone's toast at Christmas dinner. They just show up in the numbers if you know where to look, and I always knew where to look. Frank passed 3 years ago. Heart sudden, no warning. The kind of death that leaves you standing in a hospital hallway holding a coffee cup someone handed you and not remembering who. I buried my husband on a Tuesday and was back at my desk the following Monday, because the alternative was sitting in a house that still smelled like his aftershave, and I wasn't ready for that kind of quiet yet. Daniel took over running the yard. He was 34, good with the men, good with a forklift, good at the parts of the business you can see from the front counter. He was never particularly good with the parts you can only see from behind a desk, which is, I think, exactly why he never questioned who was still sitting at that desk. I kept doing what I'd always done: payroll, receivables, the license renewals nobody else remembered, the insurance audits, the sales tax filings that come due whether or not anyone's grieving, because it was mine before it was ever his. And because grief, I learned, likes a task to hide inside. I organized Frank's whole business the way some widows organize a closet, one drawer at a time, so I didn't have to look at the whole loss at once. I thought that made me part of something. I found out that Friday it just made me convenient. The Christmas of 2019, Daniel stood up at the table and thanked the whole team for a record year. And when he went around the room naming names, he named the yard foreman, he named the new dispatcher, he named Rachel for holding it all together at home. He got all the way to the pie before anyone remembered I did the books. I raised my hand halfway, the way you do when you're 12 years old and not sure you're allowed to speak, and I said lightly, "And who signs everyone's checks, I wonder?" The table laughed, the easy kind of laughter that isn't really about you. And Daniel moved on to the next toast like I'd made a small joke instead of a small correction. The summer of 2021, I asked about updating the health plan for the crew. The kind of question I'd been asking Frank for 25 years without anyone blinking, and Rachel said, in front of 2 guys unloading pallets, "That's really more of a Daniel decision now, don't you think?" Her voice had that bright, managerial lilt to it, the one she used on vendors she didn't respect. I said sure. I went back inside and finished the invoices, and I noticed, not for the first time, that Rachel had started answering questions that weren't asked of her. The winter of 2022, a bank auditor came through for our annual review, a routine we'd done every January since 1995, and Daniel introduced me to him as my mom. She helps out with some of the paperwork. Help. 30 years of balanced books, and I had become a woman who helped out. The auditor, an older man named Phil who'd done this review with me a dozen times, looked at me a beat too long before he shook my hand, like he was doing the same math I was. The spring of 2022, 1 year after Frank died, I offered to take Daniel and Rachel to lunch to talk about the business. Not to control anything, just to talk, the way Frank and I used to talk on Sunday nights with the ledger open between us. Daniel canceled twice. The third time he showed up 40 minutes late and spent the whole meal on his phone. And when I finally asked if everything was all right between us, he said, "Mom, you worry about things that aren't really your job to worry about anymore." He said it kindly. That's what made it worse. Cruelty I could have argued with. Kindness wrapped around a door closing. I just had to sit and absorb. That's not cruelty. That's honesty with a handle. Last Christmas, the 4th without Frank, I brought his old ledger to dinner. Just to show my granddaughter Maddie what her grandfather's handwriting looked like. How a man could be careful with numbers the way other men are careful with tools. Rachel picked it up, flipped 2 pages and said, "God, this is basically an antique," and set it down like it was something she'd need to wash her hands after. I picked the ledger back up. I didn't say anything. I put it in my bag, and I drove home with both hands on the wheel the whole way. The way you drive when you don't trust your own hands not to shake. For Christmases. For small cuts. None of them big enough to be a wound on their own. But I've balanced enough books in my life to know that a pattern isn't proof of one bad entry. It's proof of a method. And that wasn't even the worst thing the two of them were hiding that year. Tuesday came gray and steady. The kind of March day where the sky can't decide if it wants to rain. I'd gone back to the office that evening to finish the payroll register. The one Daniel had told me, 2 days earlier, I didn't need to worry about anymore. Though nobody had actually taken my name off the bank's signature card. Which tells you something about how much thought went into the decision in the first place. I let myself in through the side door the way I had for 31 years. And I heard voices through the heating vent that ran along the wall between the office and the small conference room Frank used to call the closet with a table in it. Daniel's voice. Rachel's voice. And a third voice I recognized after a second. Gary Pruitt, our accountant since 2004. She still has signing authority on 3 accounts, Gary was saying. You want me to draft something for her to sign? Or you want to just quietly have the bank update the card? Quietly, Rachel said. She'll make it a whole production if we ask her outright. She always does. She's not going to just disappear from a company she built, Gary said, and there was something almost like a warning in it. She's retired, Daniel said. She doesn't need a salary. She doesn't need to be on the accounts. She had her 30 years. It's my name on the building now. I stood very still with my hand on the cold metal of the vent cover, listening to it tick faintly with the cooling of the furnace. The same small metallic sound it had made every winter evening for 31 years. The sound of a building settling for the night around whoever was still inside it. She'll cry about it for a week and then she'll get over it, Rachel said. She always does. I don't want her crying, Daniel said. I just want it done quiet. Before Mother's Day, ideally. I don't want a scene at Mother's Day. It's my name on the building now. I want you to understand something about that sentence, because it's the sentence that changed the rest of this story. My son believed that sentence was true. He had believed it for 3 years. Nobody had ever corrected him, because nobody had ever needed to. I went home that night, and I didn't turn on a single light in the house. I sat in Frank's chair in the dark, the one with the worn left armrest from 30 years of resting his coffee cup there. And I thought about paperwork the way other people think about prayer. Because it's not my name on the building now. It never was his to begin with. If you've ever stood in your own kitchen and realized the people who are supposed to love you had already had the meeting without you, you know exactly what I mean. Stay with me. This is where it turns. Frank kept a fireproof box in the coat closet. The kind you buy at a hardware store for $80 and hope you never need. I hadn't opened it since the funeral. That night I did. Inside was the deed to the property at 4400, Route 9. The land and the building both, in my name and Frank's, as joint tenants with right of survivorship, which meant that when Frank died, ownership of that ground passed entirely to me. Not to the business. Not to Daniel. To me. Underneath the deed was the original loan document from 1994. The one I'd co-signed at Farmers Trust, so a 29-year-old Frank Whitfield could buy the land his father-in-law thought was a foolish bet. Underneath that was a promissory note from 2008, the one that had kept the company alive through the recession. A note that Frank and I had funded personally, out of our own savings, at 4% interest, with the business paying us back over 15 years. There were still 11 payments left on that note. Payments that, since Frank's death, had been going into an account with only my name on it. And beneath the note was a single folded piece of notebook paper in Frank's handwriting, dated the week before he died. If anything happens to me and the business ever forgets whose name is actually on the dirt, remind them gently first. If gentle doesn't work, you know what to do. You always did the math better than me anyway. Love you past the last page. I sat on the kitchen floor with that piece of paper for a long time. I want to tell you I felt triumphant. I didn't. I felt the particular kind of quiet that comes after you've been handed exactly what you need, and you'd have given anything not to need it. The next morning I called Gerald Okafor, the lawyer who'd handled Frank's estate. His office smelled like old paper and burnt coffee, the same as it had 3 years ago, when I'd sat in that same chair signing my husband's death certificate paperwork with a hand that wouldn't quite hold still. This time my hand was steady. I laid it all out on his desk, the deed, the note, the loan, the letter, and I asked him one question plain, the way I'd have asked a teller to double-check a balance. Could Daniel run a business on land he didn't own, with a loan he hadn't fully repaid, if I decided I no longer wanted him to? Gerald read for a long time without saying anything, the way careful men do before they tell you something that's going to change your week. Then he looked up and said, "Eleanor, I've been waiting 3 years for someone in your family to ask me this question the right way." He tapped the deed once, like he was underlining it. "Yes. You can end the lease arrangement with 90 days' notice, because there was never a formal lease. Daniel has been operating on an informal, revocable arrangement this whole time. The kind we usually see between siblings splitting a garage, not a working supply yard. And you can call the balance of the note due, in full, under the acceleration clause, if you believe your interests are at risk. Both of those things are entirely, legally yours to do, no permission required." I asked him what he'd do, if it were his family. He said that wasn't his to answer. He said the paperwork would answer it for me, if I let it. That wasn't even the worst thing he told me. The worst thing, the thing that made my hands go still on the desk, was that Daniel had, 6 weeks earlier, applied for a business expansion loan using the property as collateral. Property he didn't own. An application that would have been flatly denied the moment any bank actually pulled the deed and found my name sitting there, alone. Notarized in 1994, exactly where it had always been. He hadn't just forgotten whose name was on the dirt. He'd been about to build a future on top of it without asking. Gerald walked me out himself. At the door he said one more thing, quiet, almost like an afterthought. "For what it's worth, Frank came in here about 8 months before he passed. Wanted to make absolutely sure this deed was airtight. Said something about wanting you protected, no matter which one of you outlived the business." I hadn't known that. I drove home that afternoon with a version of my husband in the passenger seat I hadn't met before. A man quietly building me a floor to stand on. Years before I'd ever need it. Tuesday came gray again, 1 week later, and this time I was the one who set the meeting. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I ordered coffee I didn't drink, in a diner 2 towns over where nobody from the yard would walk past the window. And I told my son, calmly, that I was exercising my rights as sole owner of the property at 4400, Route 9, effective immediately, and that I was calling the outstanding balance of the 2008 note due in full within 30 days, as the note allowed me to do. I slid a folder across the table. Copies only, the originals stayed in the fireproof box where they belonged. Date. Note. Acceleration clause, highlighted in yellow. The way I used to highlight discrepancies for Frank when a shipment invoice didn't match what came off the truck. He laughed first. Actual laughter, the disbelieving kind, the kind that comes out before the brain has caught up to the news. Then he stopped laughing. "You can't do that," he said. "That's Mom, that's insane. That's my business." "It's your business," I said. It was never your building. He picked up the folder, flipped through it too fast to actually be reading it, the way people do when they're stalling for a comeback that isn't coming. This is because of the health plan thing. This is because of Christmas. You're punishing me for 4 years of what? Exactly, of being busy. I'm not punishing you, I said. I'm correcting a record. There's a difference, and I think somewhere in you already know it. I stood up before the coffee went cold, left a 10 on the table for 2 cups neither of us drank, and walked out into a parking lot that smelled like rain that hadn't started yet. I want to tell you I felt powerful. I felt something closer to relief, the specific, exhausted relief of a woman who has finally stopped holding a door shut with her whole body. Gerald filed the notices that same afternoon. Certified mail, return receipt requested, the way Frank always insisted anything that mattered be sent. By Friday, the phone started, and it didn't stop for 11 days. Daniel at 7:50 in the morning. Daniel at 9:15. Daniel at 11:40, voice tight, asking me to just think about this rationally. Daniel at 2:30, a text this time, call me back. This is insane. Rachel at 4:05, a voicemail that opened warm and turned sharp by the second sentence. Eleanor, I really think you're not seeing the whole picture here. As if the whole picture were something I hadn't spent 31 years assembling one column at a time. Daniel again at 6:20. Daniel again at 9 o'clock, and this one I did listen to, because his voice cracked halfway through. Mom, I have 11 guys on payroll. If the bank calls the note, I don't know what I do. Frank's brother Tom at 7:12 the next morning. A voice I hadn't heard in a year, saying I was being awfully cold for a woman who used to bring casseroles to every funeral in this family. Daniel's business partner, a man I'd met twice, at 10 o'clock, asking if there was a number that would make this go away. Rachel's mother, somehow, at 1:30 in the afternoon. A woman I have spoken to perhaps 6 times in 15 years, informing me that this wasn't very Christian. Daniel at 3:45, quieter now, asking if we could just talk, no lawyers. Daniel at 8:10 that night, quieter still, no words at all, just 15 seconds of him breathing before he hung up. Daniel at midnight, not a voicemail this time, just a text. I don't even know who you are right now. I read that one twice. Then I put the phone face down on the counter and finished drying the dishes. Rachel again the next morning, a different tone entirely, softer, almost pleading. Eleanor, think about Maddie, think about what this does to the family. As though I hadn't been the one thinking about this family since before Rachel had a driver's license. Tom again that afternoon, walking back half of what he'd said the day before. The way people do once they've had time to actually look at a deed with a date on it. Gary the accountant, careful and neutral, calling not to take a side but to confirm for the record that he'd need updated signature authority documentation, given the change in circumstances. I appreciated Gary. He was the only voice in 11 days that spoke to me like a professional instead of a problem. By the second week, the calls had a rhythm to them, the way a fever has a rhythm right before it breaks, hot, then cold, then hot again. Gerald had sent the formal notices. The bank had, quietly and correctly, declined Daniel's expansion loan the moment the collateral question came up, which apparently was its own conversation I wasn't in the room for. Somewhere in there, Daniel changed the locks on the office door, which struck me as almost funny, since the deed to the ground the office sat on had my name notarized on it in 1994. I didn't gloat. I didn't call anyone back to say I told you so. I let the silence do what 31 years of being agreeable had never managed to do. I let them sit with it. But the locks weren't the last surprise in this. There was one more thing waiting on the other side of that meeting, and it wasn't the one I expected. We met at the yard itself on a Sunday, when no trucks were loading. Daniel asked me to come. I said yes, on the condition that Rachel not be in the room, and to my surprise he agreed. He looked older than he had 3 weeks earlier. That's not a metaphor. There were new lines at the corners of his eyes, and he'd taken to standing the way Frank used to stand when he was bracing for bad weather. He couldn't stop. Weight forward, arms crossed, like the world might come at him from the front. He'd left the door to the office unlocked. New locks, old key habits gone, and I noticed he'd noticed me notice, and neither of us said anything about it. I didn't know, he said. About the deed. About the note. I swear to you, Mom, I don't know what I thought. I thought it was just always going to be mine because I was the one showing up every day. Showing up every day matters, I said. It's not the same as owning the ground you're standing on. He sat down hard in the chair across from the desk, the same desk, my desk, and rubbed his hands over his face the way he used to when he was 7, and had broken something he didn't know how to explain. The bank called, he said. About the expansion loan. They pulled the deed themselves before I even got your notice. I looked like an idiot. Or worse. I looked like I was trying to pull something. Were you? No, he said too fast and then slower, more honest. I don't know. I didn't think about it as pulling anything. I just thought, it's mine. It's always been mine. I never once thought to check. That's the whole problem in one sentence, I said. You never once thought to check. How much did you and Dad put into this place that I never knew about? How much rent have you ever paid me? I asked. He didn't have an answer. That question does that. It's not really a question. It's an audit, dressed up as one. I'm not trying to take your business, Daniel, I said. I never wanted to take your business. I wanted to be asked. I wanted one time, for someone in that office to remember that the woman doing the payroll had a name on something more than the checks. I said something I shouldn't have said, he said. About retiring. About the salary. You said something true, I said. You just said it in the wrong order. You wanted me gone before you were ready to say why. That's not an apology. That's a negotiation. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said the thing I'd actually come to hear. The thing I hadn't let myself hope for on the drive over. What do I need to do to fix this? I told him. I wasn't going to call the note due, not if he set up a real lease on paper, at fair market rent, with his own signature on it and mine, the way it should have been done the day Frank died. I wasn't going to walk away from the business Frank and I built with our own hands and our own savings and our own 4% interest, but I also wasn't going to sit in a back office signing checks for a company that treated me like a line item. I told him I wanted my name back on the letterhead. Not as a favor. As a fact. He said yes to all of it, faster than I expected. The way people say yes when they've finally understood what almost happened to them. There was one thing I didn't ask for and didn't need to. 6 months earlier, Frank and I had set aside a small trust for Maddie, our granddaughter, for college, separate from all of this, untouched by any of it. I told Daniel that trust was never in question, was never going anywhere, no matter how the rest of this went. Some things aren't leverage. Some things are just love that already has a name on it. He nodded. For a second I thought he might cry, and I let him have the dignity of not doing it in front of me. Maddie came by the house 2 Saturdays later, on her own. No one asked her to, riding her bike the 1.5 miles from her house because she wasn't old enough yet to drive and too impatient to wait for a ride. She's 12, sharp in the particular way kids get when they've spent their whole life watching adults think nobody's paying attention. Grandma, she said, sitting at my kitchen table with a glass of milk she didn't ask for and I poured anyway. Dad told me what happened. He said you basically own the whole yard. And everybody found out at the same time. Something like that, I said. He said you were really calm about it. Like scary calm. I wasn't trying to be scary, I said. I was trying to be right. Is that the same thing sometimes? I told her it could be, if you'd waited long enough to say it. She was quiet for a second, turning the glass in a slow circle on the table. Leaving little rings on the wood I didn't bother wiping up right away. Can I see Grandpa's ledger sometime? The one Mom said was an antique. I went and got it. We sat together for an hour while I showed her 30 years of a man's handwriting. Every column balanced. Every number a small act of care nobody but me had ever noticed. I showed her the page from 2008. The one where the numbers had gotten tight and Frank's handwriting had gotten smaller, like he was trying to make the bad months take up less room on the page. I showed her the page from the week Daniel was born, where Frank had written, in the margin, not for the books at all, just for himself. Boy came today. Business can wait a week. She traced that line with one finger for a long time. He really loved this place, she said. He loved what the place let him build for people, I said. That's different. I want you to know the difference someday, if any of this is ever yours. She asked me to teach her how to read a balance sheet. I said I would, and I meant it the way Frank meant that note in the fireproof box. Not as a gift, but as a floor laid down early, for someone who might need to stand on it one day. A week after that, an envelope came in the mail from Daniel. Not an email, not a text, an actual envelope, the way people used to do things. Inside was a handwritten letter, longer than anything he'd said to me out loud in years, apologizing not for the deed dispute, not for the locks, not for any of the paperwork, but for the 4 Christmases. For thanking everyone at that table except me. For letting Rachel speak for him at the yard in front of the men who unloaded pallets. For telling his own mother she didn't need a salary in front of witnesses instead of asking her, privately, what she actually needed. I didn't write back right away. I didn't need to forgive him out loud for it to be real. I put the letter in the drawer of Frank's old desk. The one where I keep things that matter too much to throw away and too much to answer immediately. It's not the trash. It's just not finished yet. The lease is signed now, fair market, both our names on it, filed with Gerald's office and a copy in the fireproof box beside the deed. My name is back on the letterhead, not Whitfield and Sons. We kept that. Some things are worth keeping even when they're not quite accurate anymore. But underneath it now, in smaller print, it says EST 1994, Eleanor and Frank Whitfield. I still sign payroll every second Friday. Nobody has ever again suggested I shouldn't. I still talk to Frank sometimes, in his chair, in the dark, coffee cup on the worn left armrest that I never had reupholstered because I liked the shape his hand left there. I told him about all of it. The vent, the fireproof box, the diner, the 11 days of phone calls, Maddie and the ledger. I like to think he already knew how it would go. He always said I did the math better than he did. That's not cruelty. That's honesty with a handle. And it turns out it was the truest thing either of us ever said about this family. Some nights I still take the fireproof box down from the closet shelf, not because I need anything in it anymore, but because I like knowing exactly what's there. The deed. The note, marked paid in full 6 months ahead of schedule, because once Daniel understood the terms, he never missed a payment again. Frank's letter, soft at the folds now from how many times I've opened it. And underneath all of it, a new page I added myself, in my own handwriting, dated the week the lease was signed. D. The ground was always going to be yours someday. I just needed you to ask first. Love you past every column I ever balanced. Mom. I'm not angry anymore. I never really was, not the way people mean when they say it. I was just done being the only one who remembered whose name was on the ground. A pen in my hand at a payroll table, told I wasn't needed, and I was the one holding the deed the whole time. That's not a twist of fate. That's just what happens when you underestimate the woman who's been doing the math all along. And that night, for the first time in 3 years, I turned off the lamp in Frank's study and went upstairs without checking the locks twice. And I slept the way a woman sleeps when she finally stops being asked to disappear from a life she built with her own 2 hands.